For weeks, whispers moved through palace corridors and newsroom briefings, but then came the moment no one expected. King Charles and Prince William appearing side by side, measured, composed, and impossibly deliberate. To many watching, it looked less like ceremony and more like signaling. And suddenly, questions once dismissed as speculation became impossible to ignore. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For days, the conversation had existed in fragments. A passing headline here, a carefully worded commentary there. Reports, analysis, and endless interpretation moved in quiet circles around one central question that nobody wanted to say too loudly. Was the monarchy preparing the public for something larger than another routine appearance? Officially, there had been no dramatic declaration, no extraordinary announcement, no confirmed constitutional shift, yet the atmosphere surrounding the my auntie felt unusually heavy, as though every movement carried more meaning than normal. Then came the appearance itself. King Charles stood not as an isolated sovereign, but alongside Prince William in a way that instantly captured attention across the world. Commentators began dissecting details usually ignored: the spacing, the rhythm of interaction, the absence of excess. Nothing seemed rushed, nothing seemed accidental. It was controlled, deliberate, and in the eyes of many observers, deeply symbolic. That was when speculation accelerated. For months, public discussion surrounding the future of the monarchy had existed beneath the surface. Charles had continued carrying out duties, while conversations around long-term continuity naturally followed in media and public commentary. None of this was extraordinary on its own. Monarchies, by design, are institutions built around succession and continuity. But timing changes everything. And when moments arrive during periods of heightened attention, by nation, even ordinary appearances begin to feel loaded with meaning. Reports and commentary quickly shifted focus away from the event itself and toward what it represented. Some interpretations suggested reassurance. Others viewed it as a message of institutional strength. More dramatic voices framed it as a visible reminder that preparation inside royal structures never truly stops. Royal historians noted that public unity between monarch and heir has often served a larger purpose than headlines suggest. The monarchy rarely speaks directly about transition. Instead, continuity is shown before it is explained, and that possibility changed the tone completely, because suddenly people were no longer discussing where King Charles stood in that moment. They were asking where Prince William stood and why. Questions multiplied. Was this simply routine duty presented under extraordinary scrutiny? Or was it something more subtle? Something carefully calibrated? Palace messaging remained measurable, quiet and restrained, offering no invitation into speculation. Statements stayed focused on continuity, service, and scheduled responsibilities. No extraordinary language appeared, no confirmation emerged, but public attention had already moved beyond official wording. The deeper conversation became less about announcements and more about symbols. Because symbols, particularly inside institutions built on tradition, often carry weight that formal statements cannot. A gesture becomes a message, presence becomes reassurance, silence becomes interpretation. And perhaps that was the most powerful part of all. Nothing dramatic had actually been said, yet millions believed they had heard something anyway. But if this appearance carried meaning, the real question was not what the public saw, it was what had already been decided behind closed doors. Long before the cameras arrived, the conversation had already begun. Not with announcements, not with declarations, and certainly not with the kind of ceremony people imagine when they think about royal transitions. Instead, it emerged the way these conversations often do, through fragments. A careful phrase repeated in commentary, a question raised in passing, a headline that seemed ordinary until placed beside another, and another, until suddenly a pattern began to appear. In recent months, public discussion surrounding future ceremonial planning had become impossible to ignore. No official institution acknowledged extraordinary change. No palace source confirmed dramatic preparation. Yet speculation continued growing, not because of what was being said, but because of what wasn't. That distinction mattered, because inside modern monarchy, silence is rarely empty. Silence creates space, and space invites interpretation. Commentators began revisiting a familiar reality. The monarchy has never functioned only through official statements. It survives through continuity, ritual, timing, and symbols that speak long before formal language arrives. Throughout history, transitions were rarely introduced to the public all at once. They emerged gradually, quietly, through adjusted responsibilities and carefully balanced appearances until people realized they had already adapted to a new reality. And that was where attention returned to King Charles and Prince William. Reports and public commentary increasingly focused on the evolving shape of Charles's reign not through dramatic claims, but through observable changes in emphasis and responsibility. William's role had expanded naturally over time. More appearances, greater visibility, broader expectations. None of this was unusual for an heir. Yet context transforms routine into significance. People began asking difficult questions. Not whether change was imminent, but whether preparation had quietly become visible. Royal correspondents revisited earlier moments in modern royal history. They pointed to periods where continuity became the message itself. Previous generations had experienced similar moments, periods where public appearances carried more emotional weight than official announcements ever could. Stability had to be demonstrated before it could be declared. And suddenly, recent events were no longer being viewed in isolation. Every appearance was re-examined. Every schedule became a point of discussion. Every phrase in palace communication attracted unusual attention. Official messaging remained restrained. That consistency itself became part of the story. Statements focused on duty, ongoing commitments, institutional service, and continuity. There was no extraordinary language, no suggestion of acceleration. Yet the more measured the response became, the louder public interpretation seemed to grow, because people were no longer looking for direct answers. They were looking for signals. Observers debated whether public reassurance had become the central goal. Others argued that people were projecting significance onto ordinary royal procedure. Even disagreement revealed something important. The conversation had moved beyond personalities. Now it was about timing. Why now? Why did this particular appearance arrive during a moment when discussions surrounding the future already existed in public consciousness? Why did routine suddenly feel intentional? Those questions lingered because timing inside institutions like the monarchy rarely feels accidental. Continuity is not simply preserved, it is introduced carefully, patiently, sometimes invisibly. And perhaps that was the unsettling realization beginning to emerge. Maybe the most important developments are never presented as dramatic turning points. Maybe they arrive disguised as normal. Yet palace history suggests major moments are rarely announced when people expect them. Royal appearances are rarely accidental, and proximity can become its own language. That realization lingered long after the headlines moved on. Because once public attention shifted from announcements to symbolism, every detail seemed to invite interpretation. People stopped asking what had been said and started asking what had been communicated. And in institutions built on continuity rather than disruption, that distinction becomes powerful. For generations, public royal pairings have carried meaning beyond the moment itself. The monarchy has long understood something modern audiences often rediscover during periods of uncertainty. Presence can reassure where words cannot. Standing together can become a statement. Shared appearances can signal stability, continuity, and readiness without ever crossing into declaration. That history made recent attention feel heavier. King Charles appearing alongside Prince William was not unusual in itself. Monarch and heir have appeared together countless times across royal history. Yet timing changes interpretation. Context reshapes routine. When public conversation already revolves around continuity, succession, and institutional endurance, even familiar moments begin to feel unusually deliberate, and people noticed. Commentators began revisiting earlier chapters of royal transition, not moments of dramatic change, but quieter periods where the public slowly adjusted to evolving realities before official language ever acknowledged them. There were periods where heirs became more visible, moments where responsibilities expanded, occasions where appearances seemed carefully balanced between honoring the present and preparing for the future, not because change had been declared, but because continuity had already begun. That idea transformed the conversation. Observers debated the significance of positioning, interaction, and ceremony not as isolated gestures, but as parts of a larger institutional language. Some interpretations remained cautious, arguing that audiences often project narratives onto ordinary royal scheduling. Others believe these moments deserve attention precisely because monarchy has historically communicated through restraint rather than explanation. And between those interpretations, something more emotional began to emerge. People were not simply reacting to Charles or William individually. They were reacting to time, because beneath discussions about appearances was something more human and more difficult to articulate: the awareness that generations shift, responsibilities evolve, and institutions quietly prepare long before the public feels ready to acknowledge it. That emotional undercurrent changed everything. Suddenly, William's expanding role no longer looked like a series of isolated appearances. It looked connected, not accelerated, not extraordinary, but connected. His increasing visibility seemed to fit into a broader narrative of continuity, rather than replacement, a reminder that monarchy presents itself not as interruption, but as endurance. Meanwhile, official messaging remained disciplined. Statements emphasized service, commitment, duty. The language never moved toward transition, speculation, or future ceremony. Institutionally, the message remained clear. The present remained the present. Yet public interpretation moved differently, because audiences rarely separate emotion from symbolism, and symbolism has a way of filling silence. That is why the conversation continued expanding. Not because anyone confirmed dramatic developments, not because official announcements changed, but because people sensed meaning in patterns, and patterns create stories long before facts arrive. The deeper question was becoming impossible to avoid. If this moment was only routine, why did it feel so significant? Still, symbolism alone doesn't explain why attention escalated so quickly. The palace did not deny the conversation, but neither did it confirm it. And in many ways, that was what transformed speculation into obsession, because people often expect institutions to calm uncertainty with direct answers. Yet monarchies rarely operate that way. Their language has never been built around urgency. It is built around continuity, around discipline, around the understanding that reacting too quickly can create a bigger story than the one being avoided. That was where the tension began to deepen. As public discussion intensified, official communication remained remarkably controlled. Statements continued following familiar patterns focused on scheduled responsibilities, ongoing service, and institutional stability. Nothing dramatic appeared. Nothing suggested acceleration. There were no extraordinary phrases, no emotional appeals, no language designed to silence interpretation. And strangely, that restraint seemed to do the opposite, because silence leaves space, and space fills quickly. Commentators began examining not only what was being communicated, but how. Every carefully measured statement became part of the discussion. Every familiar phrase attracted unusual attention. Observers wondered whether the palace was simply preserving normal procedure or managing expectations during a period of heightened sensitivity. The distinction mattered. Managing stability is not the same thing as confirming change, but to the public, those lines can become blurred. Attention shifted toward the often unseen structure surrounding royal communication: the advisors, aides, scheduling teams, and briefing culture that shape how information reaches the public. Not because these people control outcomes, but because they manage rhythm. They determine emphasis. They decide what receives explanation and what remains routine. And during moments of intense public interest, routine itself becomes meaningful. Reports and commentary began drawing a careful distinction between succession and preparation, because those are not the same thing. Succession is constitutional. Preparation is institutional. One is triggered by events. The other exists constantly. That difference became increasingly important as conversations expanded. Preparing future generations for our visibility, responsibility, and continuity does not automatically signal immediate transition. Yet once public attention locks onto that possibility, ordinary preparation can suddenly appear extraordinary. That is where expectation collided with caution. Many people wanted clarity. They wanted certainty, a statement that would settle interpretation one way or another. But institutions like the monarchy rarely move according to public impatience. They move according to preservation, and preservation often looks quiet. That quietness created its own momentum. The absence of dramatic language became dramatic. The lack of denial became interpreted as possibility. The refusal to accelerate conversation became part of the conversation itself. Soon, headlines were no longer only discussing appearances or ceremonial planning. They were discussing the palace response to the discussion surrounding appearances and ceremonial planning. The story had become self-sustaining, and perhaps that was the most revealing moment of all, because once silence begins generating more attention than statements, it means public focus has shifted beyond facts and entered something more powerful: expectation. Expectation changes how people read everything. Every appearance, every schedule, every gesture, every absence. Officially, calm remained the message. Unofficially, curiosity continued growing. And while officials focused on calm, observers started looking elsewhere for clues. What caught attention wasn't simply that William appeared, it was how he appeared. By that point, the conversation had already moved beyond speculation about headlines and into something more difficult to define. Observers were no longer asking whether public attention had intensified, they were asking why certain moments seemed to carry unusual weight. And increasingly, the answer kept returning to the same place: responsibility. Because what people believed they were seeing was not sudden prominence. They believed IY were witnessing preparation. Over time, Prince William's public role had become more visible, not through dramatic declarations, but through accumulation, more responsibility, more continuity, more moments that placed him closer to the center of institutional expectations. None of that was extraordinary for an heir to the throne. In fact, historically, that progression has often been expected. But expectations feel different when people begin imagining the future while still standing in the present. That tension changed the interpretation of everything. Commentary surrounding William increasingly reflected less interest in personality and more interest in function. The discussion became less about who he was and more about what his growing visibility represented. Modern audiences place different expectations on future monarchs than previous generations did. Visibility matters. Stability matters. Adaptability matters. Leadership today is measured not only through tradition, but through reassurance. And reassurance became the quiet center of the conversation. Not reassurance that something dramatic was happening. Reassurance that continuity exists. That institutions endure. That preparation never stops. This is where the role of a future monarch becomes unusually complex. The heir must represent tomorrow while reinforcing today, become more visible without appearing impatient, expand responsibilities without suggesting transition, carry increasing expectations while maintaining the appearance that nothing unusual is occurring. It is a difficult balance, and historically that balance has always attracted attention. Royal observers began drawing comparisons to previous generations, not to claim identical circumstances, but to note familiar patterns. Moments where heirs gradually occupied more visible space. Periods where public confidence was reinforced through presence rather than proclamation. Transitional eras where continuity was introduced through rhythm rather than time. Han announcement. The public rarely experiences monarchy as internal planning. They experience it emotionally. That emotional dimension explains why conversations escalated so quickly. Because for many people, discussions about William's role became connected to larger questions about time itself, about generations changing, about institutions evolving, about how public symbols adapt without appearing to transform. And beneath all of that sat another reality. Modern monarchy cannot rely solely on tradition. It must also communicate relevance. That creates a difficult relationship between continuity and modernization. Preserve identity but remain responsive. Honor history but reflect changing expectations. Maintain stability but avoid appearing static. Perhaps that is why moments like this attract so much attention. Not because they reveal secrets, but because they remind people that planning never truly ends. Long-term institutional thinking rarely arrives with announcements. It appears. In gradual shifts, expanded responsibility, and subtle recalibrations that only become obvious in retrospect. And once people begin looking through that lens, ordinary moments no longer feel ordinary. They begin to feel connected, purposeful, larger than themselves. But every royal transition carries something larger than ceremony. The monarchy has always treated continuity as performance and performance as reassurance. That may sound contradictory at first. Performance suggests presentation. Continuity suggests permanence. Yet for centuries, institutions built to outlast generations have understood something fundamental. People do not simply need stability to exist, they need to feel it. And that feeling has always been carefully protected. That is why moments of uncertainty inside the monarchy rarely produce dramatic reinvention. Instead, they produce something quieter and often more powerful: presence, ritual, familiarity, public moments that remind people the structure remains intact, act even while circumstances evolve behind the scenes. Because history suggests that succession is rarely introduced as a single event, it arrives gradually. Long before formal transitions ever occur, institutions begin preparing audiences emotionally. Responsibilities become more visible. Appearances become more deliberate. Expectations slowly shift until eventually people realize they have already adjusted to what once felt distant. That process is older than modern headlines. Generations of royal history have moved through periods where continuity became visible before it became official. Not because outcomes were predetermined, but because institutions understand uncertainty creates questions and questions demand reassurance. And reassurance has its own language, the language of continuity, the language of duty, the language of showing the future without announcing it. That is why public appearances can become historical markers long before anyone realizes it. At the time, they often feel ordinary. Another event, another engagement, another carefully measured moment. Only later do people return and say, that was when something began to change. Today, that process unfolds under conditions previous generations never faced. Modern media cycles do not wait. Interpretation begins instantly. Every appearance becomes analysis. Every public moment generates reaction before institutions have time to define meaning themselves. That creates a difficult balance for monarchy in the present era. Protect tradition, remain relevant, maintain restraint, communicate reassurance, all at once. And perhaps that challenge explains why conversations around continuity feel more emotionally charged now than before. Because people are not only watching institutions, they are projecting themselves into them. They see generations changing and think about time. They see expanded responsibilities and think about inevitability. They see continuity and feel uncertainty. That emotional dimension is what transforms ordinary appearances into something larger, not because people expect dramatic announcements, but because they understand, instinctively, that institutions built on endurance never reveal transformation all at once. They introduce it carefully, almost gently. And yet there is something bittersweet hidden inside that process. Continuity asks people to accept change while believing nothing has changed. Duty demands movement without disruption. Legacy survives precisely because individuals eventually step forward while others step back. That tension, the balance between permanence and transition, is perhaps the oldest royal story of all, which is why moments that seem procedural often feel unexpectedly emotional. They remind people that monarchy is not only about crowns or ceremonies, it is about survival across generations. And survival always carries a cost, because eventually every conversation about continuity leads toward a question nobody wants to confront directly. Not whether institutions endure, but who carries them next. Then came the question nobody wanted to ask out loud. Not every royal appearance announces change, but every major change leaves traces. That was the uncomfortable realization beginning to settle over the conversation. By now, public attention had moved far beyond the original appearance itself. What started as curiosity had become interpretation, and interpretation had become something larger, a search for meaning inside ordinary moments. Yet hidden beneath all the commentary was a distinction that mattered more than ever. Speculation is not confirmation, questions are not declarations, and symbolism is not evidence. But history has shown that people rarely engage with public institutions through technical definitions. They engage emotionally. They search for patterns. They compare moments. They connect details. And once enough people begin doing that at the same time, narratives can start feeling more real than facts. My attention sat at the center of everything, because despite endless discussion, nothing definitive had actually been announced. No institutional shift had been declared. No extraordinary development had been formally introduced. Yet attention continued growing. Why? Because uncertainty creates a vacuum and narratives rush in to fill it. Some observers interpreted recent events as reassurance and nothing more. Their argument was simple. Continuity requires visibility, and visibility naturally increases around senior members of the royal family. Appearances become more frequent. Responsibilities evolve. public engagement expands. That is not transition, it is preparation for eventual responsibility, something every heir experiences over time. Others saw something different. They argued that timing matters, that moments cannot be separated from context, that appearances which might once have passed unnoticed suddenly carry different emotional weight during periods of heightened public awareness. My sections. Neither interpretation fully displaced the other. Instead, both existed at once. And that coexistence made the conversation even more powerful, because ambiguity keeps people watching. The modern media environment understands this instinctively. Information no longer moves in a straight line from institution to audience. It moves through commentary, reaction, interpretation, repetition, and amplification. One appearance becomes dozens of narratives. One moment becomes competing explanations. Symbolism spreads faster than clarification. That process does not create meaning from nothing, but it magnifies what people already feel. And increasingly, people seemed less interested in receiving answers than in participating in interpretation. That shift changed the nature of the conversation entirely. People were no longer debating facts alone. They were debating possibility. What might this mean? What could this suggest? What does continuity look like when viewed through modern expectati? Those questions are compelling precisely because they cannot be resolved immediately. And perhaps that is why royal institutions remain uniquely vulnerable to symbolic interpretation. Their strength comes from continuity, but continuity itself encourages people to search for signs of what comes next. That creates a difficult reality. Narratives move quickly. Institutions move slowly. Public emotion looks forward. Official language remains rooted in the present, and between those two forces exists a space where speculation grows. Yet eventually, time reveals the difference between perception and reality. Some moments become historical turning points. Others become remembered as periods where uncertainty created stories larger than the events themselves. But in the present, nobody knows which is which, and that uncertainty may be the most powerful force of all. And in the end, the image itself may outlast every headline. Perhaps the most important announcement was never spoken aloud. After all the speculation, all the interpretation, all the attempts to decode meaning from timing and symbolism, the conversation arrived somewhere unexpected, not at certainty, but at reflection. Because in the end, perhaps this moment was never truly about announcements. Perhaps it was about continuity. That idea feels almost too simple after weeks of discussion. Yet institutions like the monarchy have always survived not through dramatic declarations, but through something quieter and more difficult to define. Endurance, presence, the steady reassurance that while individuals change, the structure remains. And maybe that was what people responded to all along. Not the possibility of transition, but the visibility of continuity. By the time public attention reached its peak, the appearance itself had become larger than the event. People projected hopes onto it, concerns onto it, expectations onto it. Some saw preparation, others saw reassurance. Some believed they were witnessing a artfully managed signal. Others believed they were seeing nothing more than routine duty placed under an unusually powerful spotlight. Yet beneath every interpretation sat the same emotional truth. People wanted stability. That desire revealed something important, not about palace strategy, but about public expectation. In uncertain moments, people do not simply look for information. They look for signs that institutions still know where they are going. And perhaps that is why the image of king and heir standing together carried such unusual weight, not because it confirmed anything, not because it announced anything, but because it suggested continuity without demanding explanation. That balance may be one of the oldest functions of monarchy itself, to represent movement without disruption, to acknowledge time without surrendering to it, to remind people that generations do not replace one another overnight, they inherit, adapt, and continue. That process is rarely dramatic in real time. I asked, history often feels ordinary while it is happening. Only later do people assign significance. Only later do they revisit moments and wonder whether they had witnessed something larger than they understood. And perhaps that possibility explains why this conversation never truly became about palace statements or ceremonial planning. It became about legacy. Legacy versus speculation. Duty versus interpretation. The quiet contrast between public imagination and institutional patience. Because monarchy, at its core, has never depended entirely on what is said. It depends on confidence that tomorrow remains connected to yesterday. That confidence is built publicly, carefully, gradually, across generations. And maybe that is the final irony in all of this. The louder the speculation became, the more powerful the silence appeared. Not empty silence, intentional silence. The kind that allows people to see continuity for themselves. Whether this moment eventually becomes remembered as symbolic or simply routine may only become clear with time, but the feeling it created, the sense of continuity, endurance, and generations, standing within the same story, may remain far longer than any individual headline. Because sometimes history doesn't arrive with a proclamation, it arrives in silence, standing side by side before the world. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.